The King of Fighters is a long-running series with a lot of entries. Each game has its own flavor and an army of die-hard fans behind it, which why I dreaded making this video for so long despite how much I was asked by you to make it. But enough hesitating. Since I played all of them for many years now, I think I'm qualified to rank them from worst to best, according to my humble opinion and taste, that by no means I claim them to be a reference or the absolute truth. A couple of precisions before starting. I'm including only the mainline games. Spin-offs like the Maximum Impact, Howling Blood and New Wave are not present. Maybe for another list. Also, KOF 98 and 2002 had both upgraded versions as we know. I'll include both versions of 98 in the same position, but as for 2002 and 2002 UM, they'll be considered as different games. The amount of changes that the UM version brought was just too substantial. I hope you don't mind that. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to it. Saying that KOF XII was disappointing would be an understatement. Released 1 year after Blaze Blue and Street Fighter IV, the game had a lot of things to prove, but unfortunately did nothing of the sort. So what was wrong with KOF XII? First, it's its bare-bone content. The game had little to offer for its single-player mode. Then there is its ridiculous minuscule roster that didn't exceed 22 characters. I know that it may sound not too bad, but for a KOF game, it's not enough at all. In comparison, KOF 94, the first entry in the series, had more playable characters. What made it even worse was that KOF XII was supposed to be a Dream Match game, meaning it had no story, but unlike the other Dream Match entries that profited from that by bringing dead characters back and expanding their roster, KOF XII did the exact opposite. And to top it all, it had one of the worst netcodes in fighting games history, making online matches impossible to enjoy. Despite all that, the gameplay itself was pretty fun with interesting new mechanics, and the graphics were a significant step up compared to older games. But still, one can't help but feel that 12 was just a glorified demo for the upcoming and much better KOF 13. The game that started it all, KOF 94, was made to be a dream match between different characters from SNK's many franchises. The idea originated when Ryo Sakazaki, the main protagonist of the Art of Fighting series, made an appearance in Fatal Fury Special. Characters were presented in 8 preset teams composed of 3 fighters each, with no option to edit them. The gameplay was simple and straightforward. The fancy combos using advanced features were nowhere to be found here. Characters usually didn't have more than 3 special moves, but can deal tons of damage, especially if the super meter is full. Speaking of supers, most of them were not easy to execute with their unusual commands. Because of that, the game was considered pretty hard and not newbie friendly at all, but nothing will prepare you against its final boss. If you ever manage to reach Regal Bernstein, first, congratulations, and secondly, be ready to face one of the cheapest and infuriating bosses in video game history. KOF 94 is so low in this list, not because it was a bad game, but more because of the series was just going to get better and better from here. The last chapter of the Nest saga was not developed by SNK. That being said, gameplay-wise, it was just as solid as previous iterations. KOF 2001 had an interesting idea that cleverly managed to tweak the striker formula without deviating too much from it. The player could choose how many playable characters he could use and how many to act as strikers, and depending on his choice, his fighters can deal and take different amounts of damage. This was a very useful tactic, especially against bosses. KOF 2001 also introduced new beloved characters like Angel, Mei Li, and Tetsu Ushima. Also Ignis, the final boss, was one of the hardest and cheapest SNK bosses ever. Unfortunately, an overall drop in quality was noticeable. This can be seen in some stages that looked washed out, a generic and forgettable soundtrack, and the characters' arts that were just hideous. However, 2001 has certainly its place in the series. It did give us a satisfying ending to the Nest saga despite the circumstances of its development, and just for that, we can all be grateful. KOF 2003 is the last entry to have a year in its title. Marking the beginning of a new chapter, the game innovated in many ways. It dropped the striker formula of the Nest arc and introduced the tag system. Similarly to games like Marvel vs. Capcom, the matches take place in one single round, during which the player can switch character anytime they want, even during a combo. Also, there is the possibility to designate a leader for the team, which will grant that character an extra special attack called the Leader Desperation move. One of the biggest criticisms received by the game is the unsatisfying and dull audio feedback when an attack connects. And while it may sound like it's not big of a deal, in a fighting game, especially in a one that requires super precise timing in its combos, it's a huge deal. Thankfully, KOF 2003 has many qualities too. In addition of bringing characters from Garou Mark of the Wolves, it introduced new ones like Shenwu, Dulon, Meilin, and of course, the controversial main protagonist, Ash Crimson. It was the first game to have more than one final boss, and the player could face either Rogal's son Adelheid or Mukai, a member of the bad guys of this saga. Also, Shizuru made a memorable comeback and played a central role in the story, which was one of the highlights of the game. And let's not forget the amazing soundtrack. This game will always have a special place in my heart, for it was through KOF 95 that I discovered the series for the first time, all the way back, well, in 95. I'm not old, you're old. I remember how my mind was blown away when I learned that we can pick 3 different characters instead of just one like the majority of fighting games at that time. KOF 95 was a revolutionary game for me. It looked amazing and its roster was so charming and colorful with realistic shapes and proportions for the most part. It was also quite difficult and had the stigma of being a game for the big boys, and I was a big boy. Unlike its predecessor, KOF 95 allowed the players to edit their teams for the first time and pick whoever they wanted. It ditched the American sports team for the more popular Rivals team. SNK brought Billy Khan from Fatal Fury, Eiji Kisaragi from the Art of Fighting series, and Iori Yagami made his first appearance here as the eternal rival of the main hero, Kyo. It was also possible to unlock Omega Rugal and Saishu, the boss and sub-boss of the game. Despite how good KOF 95 was, the series was barely starting. It would continue to improve and amaze its fans with the next entries. KOF 99 had the unlucky fate of being the direct successor of one of the best fighting games of all time, and although it was not as good as KOF 98, the game brought so many elements and features that it would be hypocrite of us to ignore. As the first game in a new saga, KOF 99 presented to us a new protagonist, K-Dash, the dark hero who became an essential character and a fan favorite instantly. He wasn't alone, of course. Many other fighters joined the roster like Whip, Jun, Shanfei, and the Kyo clones, to name a few. The main villain of the game, Chrysalid, was also quite memorable in terms of design, gameplay, and backstory. Undoubtedly, KOF 99's main innovation was the striker system. The teams were composed of 4 instead of 3 fighters, and while the matches were still 3 versus 3, the 4th character of each team can be summoned during the battle to deliver a quick attack before leaving again, allowing for more advanced combos and making combats much more dynamic. However, some risky changes were also taken, like the rollback that was changed into a weird step back and forth. I personally didn't like it. All in all, KOF 99 was a solid entry in the series. It successfully initiated the next saga and proved that SNK are not afraid of innovating and exploring new ideas. After the success of KOF 95, SNK decided to start almost from scratch again. They redraw the character sprites and immensely changed the gameplay, resulting in a game that played nothing like its predecessor, KOF 96, aka the game that hates fireballs. Seriously, all characters with the exception of a handful lucky ones saw their projectiles replaced by short-ranged ones. That was far from being the only change, however. Characters became more mobile and finally able to run. The roll forward and backward were first implemented in this game. Iconic names made their debut in 96. Vice, Mature, Shizuru, the boss's team, and of course Leona, they were all introduced in this game. A special mention to the final boss Genets with his catchphrase Kokodeska and infinite supers. And finally, we can't talk about KOF 96 without mentioning its superb soundtrack. Put it simply, this game had the best music in the entire series. Many KOF's famous OSTs like Esaka, Arashi no Saxophone 2, Fairy, Seoul Road and more originated from this game and were used and reused in countless later iterations. KOF 99 was a good game, but it was far from perfect. It surely left a lot of room for improvement, which exactly what its sequel redressed with flying colors. KOF 2000 kept everything that worked in 99 and made it better. The game improved upon the striker formula by adding a very cool twist. Each character kept as a striker had an alternate version. Sometimes it's the same fighter with a different look and a different attack. Other times it's a completely new character brought back either from a previous installment or from one of SNK's many other IPs. This new addition made the striker system much more fun and dynamic than the previous episode. With that huge number of strikers, there was tons of combo possibilities. Kula made her first appearance in this episode as a mid-boss, charged to hunt and kill Kaidash, who on his side teamed up with the newcomers Vanessa and Ramon. Lin, Seth and Hinako also joined the roster for the first time. The music, although not as good as other games, was serviceable and got the job done. On a less happier note, 2000 was also the year when SNK faced bankruptcy, which unavoidably had an impact on the series' future. Many thought that KOF 2000 was going to be the last episode in the series. Thankfully, they were wrong. 97 is hands down the best game from the Arashi saga. Of course, we're talking about the canonical entries, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The series kept enriching its roster with characters ported from other IPs and others who were totally original. Coming from the Fatal Fury series was Blue Mary, teaming up with the nicest and most considerate human being ever, Yamazaki. As for the brand new characters, we had the iconic New Faces team and the comic foil of the series, Shingo. Gameplay-wise, the advanced mode was integrated for the first time. The player no longer needed to charge his super meter manually, and his fighters were able to run and roll, making them more mobile during the combat. The music, however, was a step back compared to 96. The characters lost their original themes, with the exception of a few individuals, and we had to content ourselves with the ambient sound of the stages. If it wasn't for the Arashi team and their two superb themes, the soundtrack of this game would probably be the worst in the series. If I had to rank these games based solely on their story, KOF 97 would definitely be on the #1 spot. This entry had a distinguished dark tone. We had the unpleasure to learn Leona's tragic past, witnessed with horror the terrifying transformation of Iori under the influence of the Riot of the Blood, discovered the identity of the 3 remaining Heavenly Kings before fighting the devilish being Arashi in a memorable climactic battle. Then there is the Sacred Treasures team ending, aka the real canonical ending that closed the Arashi saga in the most masterful and epic way possible. 2002 is considered to be the real successor of 98, and the reason behind that is obvious. It plays a lot like 98. In other words, it's a blast. Being a Dream Match game, 2002 had no story, which meant the developers could bring back dead characters, and so Vice, Mature, Yashiro, Shermie and Chris, as well as other fan favorites like Yamazaki, made their big return. And it was not a simple copy-paste from older iterations either. Their sprites were reworked and they were given new moves and abilities. Newcomers to the series like Angel and K49 were also present. A future fighter from the upcoming title somehow made a jump into the past. I'm talking about Kyo's darker version, Kusanagi. Leaving the Nest saga behind, 2002 dropped the striker gameplay and adopted the traditional 3 vs 3 formula. That didn't mean the game lacked innovation in this regard. 2002's biggest change was within its max mode. After its activation, not only the character was given an offensive and defensive boost, they can cancel an attack into another one, allowing for long, intricate combos. Despite how good it is, it pains me to say that there is one game that renders 2002 vastly obsolete, but more on that in a moment. KOF XI is a weird case. All who played it agree that it's one of the best in the franchise. The problem is, not many had the chance to put their hands on it. Continuing with the gameplay established in 2003, KOF XI used the tag system as well, but in a much more efficient and fun way. This game had also the most interesting roster in the franchise, not because of the characters themselves, but more for how the teams were composed. Almost all classic teams were rearranged, but somehow it still made sense. Kula joined K-Dash for the first time, Terry teamed up with Kim and Duck King, Benimaru with Elizabeth and Dulon, and what do you know, Kyo and Iori in the same team with Shingo. With its 33 characters present from the get-go, KOF XI had already a decent roster, but you would be wrong to think that the game stopped at that number. You can in fact unlock 14 additional characters. Many of them are mid-bosses that came straight from forgotten SNK titles. KOF XI came in an era where you can have extra content just by playing the game, no need to spend more money. Those were the good times. Sadly, KOF XI had the bad luck to be released only on the PlayStation 2, beside an arcade version that was plagued with long loading times. I also remember it being heavily criticized for its dated graphics, and although no one can deny that, it was unfair to ignore everything else KOF XI did wonderfully. If you still have a PlayStation 2 hanging around somewhere in your room, I highly recommend to give this game a shot. Just like a phoenix, KOF XIII was born from the ashes of its disappointing predecessor as a masterpiece that redressed all the issues in that game and proved that the series was back stronger and prettier than ever. KOF XIII's presentation was flawless. The game was a sight to behold. It's without a doubt the best looking KOF game and probably the best looking 2D fighting game ever. Every single detail was a work of art, from the beautiful HD sprites to their detailed animation to the multiple special effects. A lot of care went to the stages, which did not disappoint in quality and quantity. The music was also pretty good and had many memorable tracks. The gameplay abandoned the tag system and went back to its roots, but had many innovations, like the addition of an extra meter called the hyperdrive that served to cancel an attack into another, which allowed for longer and deadlier combos. The roster, although not the biggest in the series, had some new faces. No, not those, unfortunately. Raiden and Wajai, characters from the first Fatal Fury games, joined Kim in his team. Vice and Mature made a comeback and allied with their killer, Iori, who, due to story purposes, used a completely different fighting style than he used to. The main villain of the game, Saiki, was also playable in his human form, but had to be unlocked first with Billy Khan. 3 additional characters were added later as DLCs. One of them was none other than Mr. Karate. KOF XIII effortlessly revived the franchise and was the successful return of the series that the fans waited for so long. The most recent game in the franchise, KOF XIV, had the arduous task to live up to its predecessor's success, but things did not look very good when it was revealed. Gameplay-wise, KOF XIV is much more accessible to newcomers and has a simplified gameplay compared to 13. The hyperdrive system was abandoned and players can cancel an attack into a super without any requirements, except for a precise timing of course. It's still a KOF game after all, and having simplified mechanics doesn't make it any easier. There is also the auto combo feature that allows to chain a series of attacks just by mashing the A button, but this technique doesn't deal a lot of damage and is quite useless against veteran KOF players. KOF XIV offered a whopping 50 characters as its release and added 8 more later as DLCs, making it the fighting game with the biggest roster of its generation. Many familiar faces were present as well as a lot of new ones. Being the first game of a new chapter, it introduced a new protagonist, Xiii, whose design, let's be honest, is all over the place. The game finished with a big cliffhanger implying that many dead characters may return in the future episode. 14 was heavily criticized for its graphics since it was first revealed. The previous game had set the bar too high in this regard that the fans were very disappointed by how 14 looked. Although I can see where they're coming from, I still think that these criticisms were overly exaggerated. Yes, it is not the best looking fighting game of its generation, but when it comes to the look of the characters themselves, I think that the transition from 2D to 3D was successful. Many characters look better in 14 than how they did in 13. All in all, KOF 14 is a blast to play if you can see beyond its graphics. KOF 98 is the game that refuses to die. It's impressive that even after more than 20 years of its release, the game is still so enjoyable to play, and its presence in many recent tournaments confirms that. 98 was the first Dream Match game in a series considered as a Dream Match itself. The game didn't have any original character or new gameplay mechanics. Everything 98 offered was already present in 97. But here's the thing, KOF 98 did everything much better. The level of polish in gameplay was astonishing. The combos were very tight and demanding in timing. They were short and simple and didn't have to be as long and fancy as the ones in 2002 and 13 for example, to be extremely satisfying when executed correctly. All characters from the Arashi saga, including the dead ones, were present. The Arashi team knew their golden age in this game. Haiden, Takuma and Saishu formed the Masters team. The American sports team made their first appearance in years and the last to date. KOF 98 is the most popular entry of the series. For many, it's the best KOF game, period. I myself used to think so until very recently, and I almost gave it the #1 spot again. There is a reason why the most successful games in the series are the ones that have a similar gameplay to 98. SNK released an upgraded version titled Ultimate Match, which added more characters, more stages, a new mode and applied many tweaks in the gameplay. However, the standard version lost nothing of its charm either and is still as relevant as it was before. Both versions are equally good and a lot of fun to play. You can't go wrong with either of them. And #1, KOF 2002 Unlimited Match. I have to say, it's very ironic that the worst and the best games in the King of Fighters series were released in the same year, but that's the only common point between 12 and 2002 The game was released in a time where many of KOF fans had already moved on, which explains why it's not as popular and known as 98. Had it been released in the series' golden age, the game would have much more fame and recognition. still, those who had played it know how good it is. It's basically KOF 98 on steroids. It has everything you liked in that iteration and adds more to the formula. The max mode mechanic from the standard version is still here and allows for more elaborate combos without being too long like KOF 13's. 2002 UM hit just the right sweet spot between 98's simple gameplay and 13's intricate one. All characters were buffed and have some neat attacks and follow-ups that unfortunately never appeared again in other titles. You would be pleased to know that the game was well balanced, and although there are clear S-tier fighters, all characters were relevant and strong in their own ways. And did I mention that there is a total of 60 of them, making KOF 2002 UM the game with the biggest roster in the series, and that without including the alternate versions of some characters. All the stages were redone, the themes of each team were recomposed, some of them were rearranged from older themes, while others are brand new compositions. They're all of good quality. The artworks were redrawn and all characters look stunning. This game has it all if it wasn't for the dated sprites that I personally don't mind at all. Now, if we could have a remake of 2002 UM with the graphics of 13, we would have the ultimate King of Fighters game. I'm aware that you may not agree with this list, which is totally fine. You can tell how wrong I am and which game of the series is your favorite down in the comment section. Special thanks to my patrons for their generous support. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and why not consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.